I've had the 11-inch M4 iPad Pro for about a week now, and this video is simply meant to share some of my first impressions. Note that I primarily use my iPad for entertainment, specifically watching content on something like Netflix or Apple TV, Crunchyroll, YouTube, but I do also use it for productivity periodically, as well as gaming, though this is more of a recent development. I traded in my 10.9-inch iPad Air for the M4 iPad Pro, and many of my first impressions are comparisons to my previous device. Beginning with the form factor, as that is the first noticeable difference straight out of the box. Even though all modern iPads are thin, the new M4 iPad Pros are even more so, and this is very noticeable after using a thicker iPad Air for 4 years. As someone who periodically reads on their iPad, mostly news and academic articles, the thinner and lighter design is appreciated as it's more comfortable in the hands for longer periods. The next most noticeable difference between the M4 iPad Pro and my old 2020 iPad Air is the display, which was my primary reason for upgrading. I have never owned a 120 hertz display before, and until seeing it, I didn't think I was missing out on all that much, but after seeing it, I cannot understand how I was living without it. It is undeniably a better experience with much smoother graphics. Immediately after setting up the device, I became addicted to swiping between the home screens simply to watch how smooth the animations were. After a week of use, however, that fascination has worn off just a bit. Also, with regard to the display, the max brightness on the M4 iPad Pro is much higher than my old 2020 iPad Air. With the Air, I found myself having to keep the brightness at max or near max for most of the day, but with the M4 iPad Pro, I rarely go above half. This is a neat feature, but given my use cases and where I engage in those use cases, an ultra bright display isn't exactly high on the list of necessities. The OLED, on the other hand, is incredible. Like with ProMotion, I cannot understand how I was living without an OLED display now that I have experienced it. The most noticeable difference is that blacks are actually black. Thus, the contrast is amazing. I have been slowly rewatching some of my favorite shows and movies, and it almost feels like a whole new experience in some cases. You can see in these clips here where I'm watching The Days on Netflix that most of the screen is pitch black. On my old 2020 iPad Air, those areas would essentially be dark gray, making it more difficult to distinguish between the lit elements and those in complete black. Between ProMotion and OLED, the upgrade was well worth it, in my opinion. Now for some other random first impressions before talking about gaming on the M4 iPad Pro. Firstly, the volume buttons. I haven't figured out if this is a setting or something else, but the volume buttons are reversed in landscape from my 2020 iPad Air. Normally, when I have the device in landscape, the left volume button, which would typically be the top volume button in portrait, remains volume up, and the right volume button remains volume down. For whatever reason, that's reversed on the M4 iPad Pro. Again, maybe this is a setting, I just haven't found it yet, but it's been hard to get used to. The battery life on the M4 iPad Pro is ridiculously longer than my 2020 iPad Air. Some of that may be due to it simply being a newer device with greater max battery capacity, but I think a lot of it has to do with this new display. Because the display is so bright and the OLED offers such better contrast, I don't need to have the display brightness turned up as high. Thus, it's using much less battery throughout the day. It used to be when I took my 2020 iPad Air to lunch for an hour, I would end up using about 30% of the battery. But with the M4 iPad Pro, I'm only using about 5%. That is a crazy difference. I now get nearly a full day of use on a single charge, and most of that is watching content. Lastly, the face unlock. My 2020 iPad Air used Touch ID, but this new M4 iPad Pro uses Face ID. Due to muscle memory, I still hold my finger over the lock button when picking up the M4 iPad Pro, thinking that's how I'm supposed to unlock it, which results in an arrow prompt on screen pointing to the front-facing camera, which is now on the landscape. Because of this muscle memory, I'm often covering the Face ID when first picking up the device, so it rarely unlocks right away. However, once I can overcome that, then I'll likely prefer Face ID as it is typically faster and easier. And one last difference, now that I'm thinking about it, with regard to the case. The folio case with my old 2020 iPad Air, it did not support multiple upright viewing angles, but the one for the M4 iPad Pro does. With the new folio case, you essentially have two upright angles. You have an option for a nearly 90 degrees and another for the typical 120. For my old iPad Air, my 2020 iPad Air, the folio case only supported the more obtuse 120 degrees. At first, I couldn't think of a situation where having a 90-degree angle would even be required, but I have since found myself in several situations where it has actually been handy. Perhaps Apple has been doing this for several years with the folio case. I just had not experienced it before, so that was a nice surprise. There are other differences between my 2020 iPad Air and the new M4 iPad Pro, of course, like the much better front-facing and back-facing cameras, as well as the inclusion of the LiDAR scanner for AR applications, but I'll likely never use those features, certainly not in any way to justify having them. The M4 iPad Pro also has improved audio with a 4-speaker design, but in my limited use, I haven't noticed a massive difference between it and my old 2020 iPad Air, probably because I don't often listen to things at very high volume. The same is true of the inclusion of the Thunderbolt port on the M4 iPad Pro. Perhaps this will come in handy if I try connecting it to an external display, but it won't be happening very often. Okay, and moving over to gaming, I rarely used my 2020 iPad Air for gaming. When I did, it was more so to see what it was capable of and simply what games are available. The only game I played in its entirety was Diablo Immortal, which incidentally was what convinced me that the iPad could certainly be an incredible mobile gaming platform if titles of similar quality were to keep releasing. Fast forward to today, and we see more and more games coming to the iPad. This was my secondary reason for upgrading to the M4 iPad Pro. With console quality games more readily available, I wanted to ensure I had a device and a chip that was capable of playing them. However, at present, I'm not sure any of the titles on iPad currently take advantage of the M4 chip. Some games certainly could, but they either need to be optimized or simply need to give players the option to bump up the graphics settings. After getting the M4 iPad Pro set up, I immediately tried playing Warframe. This was actually my first time playing the game on any device. I have known about it for a while, particularly because many people compare it to Destiny, which is one of my favorite titles. But I never really felt inclined to give it a try. Now that it's on iPad, though, I figured, I would. Unfortunately, though the gameplay is fun, the experience on iPad is sort of a bit of a letdown. I have this powerful modern chip in my iPad, and yet it looks like Warframe is playing in 720p or lower, and it's painfully noticeable. It does run generally smooth, however, though I had a couple glitches when I first launched it. I'll keep the game installed because I do enjoy it, but I really hope the devs release an update that allow us to up those graphics settings. I've also played Genshin Impact on the M4 iPad Pro, which looks much better than Warframe, as well as Diablo Immortal, which looks equally as good. Both support much higher resolutions, 1080p at minimum, maybe higher, and with the M4 chip, graphics settings can be maxed with plenty of overhead. I'm anxious to see what the M4 can do with some of the upcoming titles, such as Assassin's Creed Mirage, which is being advertised as a AAA mobile HD adventure on the App Store. So that's pretty exciting. However, given the less than stellar port of Resident Evil 4 on iPad, which aims for 1080p and only supports up to 30 frames per second, I'm a bit worried that the developers are quickly producing and porting titles to capitalize on the large App Store audiences, but they're not really properly optimizing or offering comprehensive graphics options to support the range of chips, particularly my new M4 chip. Anyways, that's it for this one. See you in the next.
Finally, a little light. Wait.